Welcome to this week's episode of the Luke Alfred Show. As we had 2 weeks ago, I have as my guest Ian Raystake, sporting polymath, knows far more about sport than I ever will. But I must also just say that he is a senior lecturer in film at the University of Cape Town, so he wears other hats. The subject for discussion this week, listeners, is we've decided to have a look at South Africa's best sportsmen in the democratic age. It's really an unanswerable question, a bit of a parlor game, but we're going to have some fun. I'm going to put forward some names. There are others, but in no particular order. Ernie Els, Fourie du Preez, Jacques Kallis, Wade van Niekerk, Chad le Clos, Josiah Tugwani, Baby Jake Matlala, and Ian's personal favorite, Lucas Radebe. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. Would you take it off?
Thanks, Luke, and great to be back. Thank you for that. So I was thinking about this idea of what makes a great sportsman, and I thought about it in terms of a great single performance. I remember getting up at 4 a.m, whatever, to watch Josiah Tugwani win the marathon at Atlanta, or Wade van Niekerk's amazing 400 run. And then I thought about players who have accumulated amazing records over time: Jacques Kallis in cricket, Baby Jake in boxing, Siya Kolisi, double World Cup winning captain. And then I thought that there's a third category for what determines greatness, which is this idea of character, something off the field, some ineffable quality perhaps that we look for.
Sort of stature, perhaps.
Stature and grace, I suppose, in a sense. And Lucas Radebe was my first thought. If you look at him, there's the career, the 70 caps for South Africa, the captain at 2 World Cups, his storied career in Leeds, of all places, in the north of England, and captain of Leeds, club captain for many years. And then there's also the individual elements of his story, the fact that he was shot in the street in Johannesburg in the early 1990s, the famous game where he dons the keeper's gloves against Man United after their keeper gets sent off. So there's all these great elements to his story as well. But what I found amazing when I went back to look at Lucas's career was that his physical stature, he's my size, he's 1.80 m, 80 plus Ks. And yet when I looked at him on the field as a younger person, I thought he was taller. I thought he was bigger. He looked so much more immense on the field, perhaps because barely anyone ever got around him to score a goal. He was a great defender, quick, nimble, very physical, and yet always this tremendous sense of calm and control. Even when he's filling in as keeper against Man United, he's got a smile on his face for half of that game. So I love that element of his calmness, of his leadership, and the fact that he's carried that on since he quit football. He's done amazing charity work. He's one of the great ambassadors for South Africa. I was there when he got his honorary degree from UCT in social sciences, and what a lovely man. So I sort of felt that Lucas Radebe ticks all those elements for me: the great performances, the great career, and this kind of other quality that we look for in our heroes.
He also had very dodgy knees, and he played through quite a lot of pain at certain stages in his career. I mean, I remember Africa Cup of Nations in 1996, where he didn't play at the beginning of the tournament, and the understanding was that he would only be used fairly sparingly. That's why Howard Wilkinson released him from Leeds, and Clive Barker had to sort of nurse him through the tournament.
Yeah, and he had a few moments in Leeds where he was out, and then he came back. Yeah. He had a long spell before he came back for the 2002 World Cup as well. So I mean, he had definite problems with injuries, even at Kaizer Chiefs, in fact, before he went to Leeds.
Do the characters of the early post-readmission phase, so the early 90s and the middle 90s, do you think for our generation they take on a particular luster because of the times in which they're played? So in a way, you might refer to them as the kind of the honeymoon sportsman and woman. And there's a degree of romance
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
that period, and we should be wary of that.
I think what's interesting about that period also is that they are, if you look at Lucas transfer to Leeds for £250,000, and apparently really only because Phil Masinga, who had been signed by Leeds, wouldn't sign without Lucas joining him. And then you look at Harry Maguire joining Man U for £80 million. And there's
Not a very well spent £80 million, many would
perhaps,
say.
yes.
Yeah.
But I think part of the romance about it is that we still felt at that stage that there was a sort of, innocence is the wrong word, but certainly a naivety perhaps around our emergence back into international sport. And the fact that for many of our players, they were finally getting the recognition they deserved. And they didn't have the kind of arrogance of having been kind of millionaire professionals for a decade.
Naivety or innocence can be enabling
Yeah.
as well, because you don't necessarily know what you don't know. And there is a sense, one of my favorites from that period is Josiah Tugwane.
Yes.
Well, for autobiographical reasons, I wasn't at the Olympic Games, but I got a junket to Atlanta before the Olympics. So I sort of had a sense of the 1996 Olympics. And Tugwane was fascinating because although there was a tradition of South African marathoning, he was all by himself, really, with a slight exception maybe of Gert Thys and a marathon team. But he didn't ever do anything as well again.
Yeah.
And it was just like this golden moment
Yeah.
where he took on a gifted South Korean athlete. And it wasn't as though he ran in the 2000 Olympics. I think he might have run in the 2000 Olympics, but didn't do very well. He didn't generally do very well outside of the 1996 Olympics, but it was a wonderful moment. To come back to the point, do you think there is a sort of a retroactive gloss which we sort of impose on this period, which partly has to do with us?
I think very much so. And I remember the way we felt watching that 96 team win the African Cup of Nations with Neil Tovey and Lucas and Mark Williams and Mark Fish. And a lot of those players did go. I mean, Fish had quite a good career in England as well. And a lot of those players, we felt, I think part of it was we felt that we were actually, we were achieving, we'd won this title, and our players were performing well internationally. We felt that they were doing well by South Africa. They were matching up to the best international players. But I also feel that in many cases there was a sense of humility about the players. I remember when Quinton Fortune played for Man United, and I remember thinking, imagine what it must be like to be Quinton Fortune taking the field with, all these legends of the game, with whom he played. So I feel there's a level of humility and a level of the kind of country mouse about a lot of South African sports compared to the players they were playing with and against.
In that period.
In that period, particularly. Okay. And as we went on, we had Benny McCarthy, for example, to me was not of that period. Benny McCarthy belongs to a definite sort of a newer emergence of South African sports stars who were part of the more moneyed, the kind of millionaire game, which I think maybe because of when we came out of isolation, we were on the cusp in a way, certainly in rugby, for example, on the cusp of the professional era. And so I think that's definitely affected the way we look at those players. We look at them with a sense of nostalgia, I think, definitely.
Because the 1995 World Cup winning side, the rugby side, was an amateur side.
Yes.
And that, the professionalism debate in rugby only came after that, 1996, 1997. One of the players whose names we haven't mentioned, or I haven't mentioned, and a player who's pivotal because he seems to put a kind of a full stop or a bookend on that lingering innocence, naivety, country mouse thing, is Hansie Cronje.
Yes. I was thinking about that.
It's Hansie Cronje, isn't it? And I wouldn't necessarily include Hansie Cronje in the list of top sportsmen, but in terms of an influential figure and possibly quite a baleful figure, although there is a constituency in South Africa that still reveres Hansie. Tell me about Hansie and what your feelings about Hansie are.
The funny thing is, when I was thinking of cricketers, I thought of beyond Callis and de Villiers, who are the sort of two maybe more obvious candidates. I thought that Hansi, and the person I thought about him with strangely was Hashim Amla, because they were both.
I wouldn't have necessarily
No,
put
but
the two together.
It was because they both struggled a bit initially. Hashim had that sort of beginning part of his career where he kept on going out to particular deliveries.
And his technique was undermined by television.
And
Mike
then,
Haseman in particular.
Yes, but then Hashim goes through this period, this absolutely amazing patch where he's one of the best batsmen in the world. And he's a very different character to Hansi. But I thought that they both, when they came to the fore, they both had the kind of the weight of the nation on their shoulders in different ways. And Hansi was carrying us through this very, very particular. He was the one who took us into battle against that fearsome Australian team for many years. When Hush took over, he was taking over the mantle of being a non-white, a Muslim, all these firsts that were being thrown at him in a way. And as a captain, for a man who was unlike Hansi, very kind of quiet and retiring in many ways, not the sort of figure that Hansi cut on the field. But I think Hansi is an interesting character because if he had, you're right, he's baleful. The decline of Hansi, even the bizarre circumstances of his death, to me that's what creates part of the story for him. Is like this very much the rise and fall, and this kind of period in his life where he seemed to be one of the most gifted all-rounders in world cricket. One of the players who was able to take it to the Australians aggressively and sort of win games. And then this other part of his career, the kind of downslope, which seems so tragic by comparison, and yet very much of his own making. And I think there's a deeper story to be told around the influence of sort of faith and religion and piety in South African sport, which I think Hansi would be a very important part of. And that's sort of part of what makes that decline so tragic, I think.
I mean, another name that I didn't mention at the beginning of the show, but goes very nicely with Hansi, is that of Alan Donald. And you don't necessarily associate Alan Donald with maybe a Dale Steyn, but that's not quite right, is it? I mean, you look at the old videos of Alan Donald and that sequence against Mike Atherton at Edgbaston in 1998 where Boucher drops the catch.
And the one against Mark Waugh.
Yeah, and Donald nearly jumps out of his cardigan in anger. And Donald was, I mean, he had a seamless, perfect action. And he was a peerless fast bowler.
He is flat out my favorite South African fast bowler still.
Right.
And I love watching Dale Steyn, and I love watching the current crop Lungi and the new bowlers who are developing. KG's got the most gorgeous kind of action. Right. But there's something about watching Donald steaming in and that kind of lightness, the way he almost seems light on his feet when he gets to the wicket. And I think you're right. And Donald, interestingly, again, had a long career in England that goes back in a way that kind of, in a way, bridges the apartheid
and
break.
Precedes,
and one of those our cricketers, Clive Rice was another one who had a fantastic career in England during that period before he came into the international fold. And so a lot of our cricketers had a name in a way before they had made their name internationally because they'd been playing county cricket for such a long time and with such great success. So, yeah.
If Hansi Cronje is a kind of a pivotal figure or a figure which signals the end of an age of innocence, for want of a better term, who are the figures that come after Hansi Cronje? And let's not confine ourselves to cricket here.
I was thinking of that, Luke, because I was thinking also about how this question you've asked often relates to team sports, or like how do we evaluate team sports as opposed
in relation
to individual?
Yeah, swimming and golf and
So I mean,
Ernie Els.
So here's an interesting one. I mean, in response to that, my thinking of Olympic moments again, probably my most heart-stopping, and I often go back and watch this video on YouTube just for the feels, is the South African swimming relay team in I think it's 2004. With Schoeman and Athens, and that amazing victory over the Americans and the Australians in the pool, and the sheer kind of the way the blood passes when you watch that race, it's unbelievable. And that was obviously a combination of four great swimmers, or three great swimmers, and then a swimmer who kind of gets neglected because he didn't win individual medals back in, which is Lyndon Ferns, I think, in that group. So I mean, in a way, what I find interesting is that we tend to focus on, we don't. It's in a way we've done well with team sports, so cricket and rugby. So I mean, my question to you around that was like, how do we evaluate the greatness of a player who performs as part of a team? And of course, the interesting one about Callis is Callis was both a team man, but also a great individual accumulator of statistics over his entire career. And then athletes. So, for example, if you had to pick a swimmer, I think you mentioned Chad le Clos earlier, and how does that sort of individual greatness stack up against, for example, someone who performs as part of a team? Hansi's a good example. You know, Hansi could have a bad game, but we could win the match as a team because collectively we got him over the line. Whereas if you're the individual swimmer in the pool and you have a bad day, there's nowhere to hide. There's no team to kind of bail you out of those performances.
Look, I think that consistency of performance has to find its way into, weighing up what someone is worth. And in that regard, you have to think that players like Victor Matfield, Fourie du Preez, Jacques Cullis, A.B. de Villiers to some extent, they did what they did over a long period of time, over successive series, etc. But contrast that with the swimming gold in the pool in Athens in 2004. That foursome at Barcelona in 2003 only got into they only qualified for the final of the World Championships because there was a scratching.
Yes.
I think it was the Swedes or something. So South Africa got into the final through the back door. They were ninth. They got in eighth place. And I remember Rake Neertling saying to me, he said something like, we were so bad in the final in Barcelona that no one even knew we were there.
Yeah. Which is strange to think a year later.
So a year later, they managed to beat some of the powerhouses of men's international swimming. Peter van den Hoogenband, Michael Phelps, and that is remarkable. But you think, and this sounds a bit churlish. I'm almost embarrassed to say it. It is a once-off.
Yeah. But doesn't it make you think, going back to your earlier point about how we feel about those initial post-apartheid athletes? I remember watching that race, and I was watching with the American commentary, and I was so glad that they didn't mention us. I was like, yeah, screw you, we're going to beat you guys anyway. No one's even looking at South Africa. They were so obsessed with Australia in the lane alongside them that they didn't notice us. And we snuck up and beat them at the wall. And it almost happened again in the Olympic silver at the last Olympics with the runners, where no one was talking about. No. And even I would say Wade van Niekerk, when he wins the 400, everyone's obsessed with Karani James, and Wade van Niekerk just doesn't stop. He just keeps pulling away and wins that amazing gold. So here's a question for you, Luke. Like, we've done well in the pool. We tend to do well in the pool at Olympics, certainly. I feel that we constantly get disappointed by our track athletes, track and field. And that point you make about consistency, we are craving the consistency of Frankie Fredericks is probably, though not South African, Namibian, was a character who always used to perform pretty much at every single event. You could guarantee Frankie was going to be a medalist, and he was always there or thereabouts against some of the best athletes in the world. And I kind of feel that in athletics, we almost get there. We've had so many promising athletes who we think, oh, this is the one they're going to win the gold or they're going to win a silver. And then something happens in the race and it's just not their race. And then they go to the Diamond League and win a few races, but they don't really get it at the big event. Do you think we've been disappointed by our track athletes in many ways?
Look, I think there's an institutional dimension to this. And there is a dimension about the culture of the sport behind these big events. And, I don't think athletics in this country is well coached. I don't think it's that well developed. And I don't think we make the transitions between Olympics very well. That takes nothing away from that Wade van Niekerk win in Rio.
Absolutely, yeah.
In which he was in lane 8.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what makes it so remarkable.
And aside from the van Niekerk performance, the moment is worth unpicking, because here is a guy who ruptures cruciate ligaments playing touch rugby.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you shouldn't overuse the word tragedy in sport because it doesn't necessarily always belong there. But Wade van Niekerk might have been the greatest 400-meter athlete that ever lived. And he was just a pale shadow of himself. And there was pathos in seeing him run the 200 meters in this latest Olympics. He couldn't run the 400 meter, not really. And basically he was living on fumes of lost ability, lost life. And that was horrible, and to think of what, and I come back to my point about institutional support, intelligence, good people around him, a good culture around him, good systems around him. That is really, in the last 30 years in South African sport, that is one of the horror shows of South African sport, isn't it?
Yeah, and maybe it's the reason why we value the teams or the individuals that function in sort of well-functioning spaces. So we look at the way rugby's been kind of supported at a national level.
Point.
And at schools level as well, compared to sports that are kind of, which should be prominent for us, but are often considered sort of marginal to that. And the number of those athletes, most of our swimmers are training overseas. Very few of them are training in South Africa.
Or the athletes that go the other way. They are individual athletes, but they plug themselves into an international system with good coaches. You think the golfers, you think Ernie, we haven't discussed Ernie, two US Opens, 2 Open Championships.
The green jacket.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was some interesting tussles with Tiger in his time, and a slow fading away for the Big Easy. But he did it. He did it as an individual athlete.
Absolutely.
And there are all the other South African golfers who've competed well internationally as well.
Yeah. I should make my correction. It was the green blazer, not the green jacket, before anyone chases me with an 9-iron.
No, that's okay, Ian. You can stay on the show.
So I have to say this. So if we think about, we've been talking about like sort of the major sports, the Olympic major sports and great team sports. How about the outliers? What about the sports that don't get enough attention? So I had one or two characters here. My one was, and they're both in fact related to the sea. The one is Oscar Chalupsky, who I know straddles, he's cheating a bit because he was doing a lot of his best stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. But Oscar Chalupsky, in a way, defines the notion of kind of not only the literal Iron Man, but also that sort of indefatigable South African like toughness that we look for in our sportsmen. And then the other one, entry character, is Grant Baker, who's the big wave surfer, who's also parlayed a really interesting career in the surfing community now that there's a big emphasis on starry big wave surf championships, which never used to be a thing really in the 1980s. There were a few big tournaments at places like Pipeline, but with the advent of the big wave tour, places like Mavericks in California and Jaws in Hawaii and Chopu, Grant Baker's become a bit of a sort of folk hero in a way. He's surfed these massive waves. So I wonder if our obsession sometimes in sport with the kind of recognition of the central sports has meant that we've missed out on some of the kind of outliers who we may have have we neglected somebody?
Not only outliers, there's a relationship between sportsman, television, and memory.
Yes, interesting.
Isn't there? And a lot of these sportsmen would have been televised. Those feeds would have come into South Africa. But you think about Benny McCarthy. Yep. Now there's a name, you've mentioned Lucas, but there's a name we haven't mentioned, Benny's. So Benny plays a pivotal role in Porto winning the Champions League in 2003, Definitely. Scores goals for Porto, is transferred after that, but is also plays a part in the rise of Jose Mourinho, because directly after the Porto win in the Champions League in 2003, Jose goes to Chelsea and assembles a side there and wins the Champions League there and wins the title for Chelsea, etc. Not a lot of that was ever seen in South Africa.
Exactly.
I think a little bit of Porto in the Champions League run, but not so much Porto in the Portuguese league.
Yeah.
Not that type of thing. And so we saw Benny when he played for Bafana Bafana. Certainly, we understand that. But there's a kind of a neglect or a sort of hidden element to Benny that makes that also difficult to judge.
And perhaps because we're often obsessed with the English game. We look at Europe
rather than the European game.
And we look at often even players now who are playing in England, maybe in lesser teams, even in the Premiership, and are playing in Spain or Portugal or Turkey. We had a lot of players in Turkey for a while.
Shoes Mashwaya.
Shoes.
Yeah.
Then we're looking at the idea that we're guided. I love your idea about the relationship between the TV and the audience. One of my abiding memories as a child was watching Clive Rice in the Silk Cut Single Wicket Challenge, which was televised. So it was the one example of a South African up against the best in the world. He was playing against Imran Khan and Kapil Dev.
So the Silk Cut Single Wicket Challenge.
Yeah.
What was this in England?
It was in England.
Okay.
It was like play one
so
of the
Richard Hadley, Imran Khan, that generation.
Imran Khan and Kapil Dev, and this amazing kind of sort of out of the blue single moment of sports excellence where Clive Rice was competing, and you realize that's how good he was. He was mentioned in the same breath and that individual televised experience lived on with me for years, because it was one of the few examples I had at that stage of seeing South Africans competing internationally. So I do think it's a very good point you make about the relationship between an audience for an event and how we remember greatness in our sports players.
I like the idea of unorthodoxy. And I think that what has happened in international sport, and this is so apparent in highly coached, highly regimented international rugby sides, but correspondingly overcoached Premiership or international football sides. So unorthodoxy, what part does say the Paul Adams
yes
sort of
I knew you were going there.
Yes. Okay. Well, I kind of foregrounded myself. But what frog in what was the Andy Capistanio?
Frog in a blender.
The frog in a blender. What hubcap are you going to steal next, Paul? Kind of thing. And what part does the unconventional play, or should it play in a list like this? Because he was like nobody else.
Absolutely.
If you make sense of him in terms of statistics, no great shakes, but he brought flavor to what he did, which was uniquely South African.
I remember him baiting Dominic Cork at Newlands, playing an epic last wicket stand in the test there. So I'll like brief sojourn. So there's that famous Spike Milligan series of books about like when Mussolini, my part in his downfall, and Hitler, his part in my downfall. So my part in Paul Adams' rise to fame is that I was a leg spin bowler at primary school. He used to bowl turning away from the wicket. I used to bowl over my ear with my head turned down to the left. And I took a hat trick in a game once, and I got 20 cents from the umpire as a reward for my hat trick. And I got to high school, and I had a coach who pretty much let everyone just play the way they wanted to. And I got to high school, and I had a very, very earnest young student coach in my B team cricket who was convinced that I needed to be side onto the wicket. I needed remedial help with my action, and I couldn't spin the ball anymore. I just got tonked all over the park, and so I ended up being a terrible medium pacer and not playing cricket. So that's my part in Paul Adams' rise. I remember people talking about how he was sort of uncoached. He developed this unique action as a way, because he was neglected. And until he got to this point where he was obviously very successful at playing the way he did. So his unorthodoxy is very interesting from that point of view.
But he also wasn't neglected in the sense that there were people along the way sort of who littered his road, if you like, who had the kind of intelligence and experience not to tamper with him.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's very important. When we look at good sides and good individuals, there have to be people in the backstory, coaches, parents, friends, supporters, whatever, who actually make that rise possible, who make sacrifices, who spend money, who spend extra time, the schlepping to early morning swimming coaching, that type of thing. And I think that Adams actually came to the fore at a time in South African cricket culture when there was still quite a lot of good institutional knowledge in the system. I do find myself wondering whether that still exists today.
Well, there were great players around him who'd been playing for a while.
And great coach Eddie Barlow, Duncan Fletcher, I think people who allowed him to be.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the orthodoxy idea, what I find interesting, nowadays it seems too obvious maybe to be an unorthodox idea, but it's amazing to hear how often rugby pundits not from South Africa talk about Cheslin Colby being this mold breaker in a world of kind of 120 kilo wings where everyone wanted to be John Alomu. Here's this guy who's 170, 82 Ks, who is unquestionably one of the world's best players at the moment and gives opposition defenders nightmares week in and week out. And I think back to me, one of the early examples of that character was actually Peter Rousseau, who I remember watching from when he was an under-19 player, that kind of gangly, awkward gait, and people saying, yeah, he scores tries, but he looks terrible. He's never going to play for the Boks because he just looks awful when he runs. And I said, yeah, but he scores a lot of tries and he's really elusive. And I watched him kind of come up from under 19 into under 21.
He's got great hands. He's quicker than you think.
And a very smart guy.
Yeah,
I mean, his ability to think apart opposition defenses. 4 tries against France in that famous Test match. Countless tries in Super Rugby, and that, just an amazing player, and one who was very unorthodox for South Africa at a period when we wanted our wings to look a certain way. We wanted our rugby players to look a certain way, and Peter Rousseau was not that guy. So he wouldn't go down as like one of the greatest South African rugby players, but I think he's important in getting us to think about our orthodoxy in terms of how we look at our major sports like cricket and rugby, where we look at technique and we look at what we believe a player should look like. And a guy like Rousseau comes along. I mean, one of the interesting rugby players is a guy like Os du Randt, who takes 6 years out of the game, 5 years out of the game, in between comes back, makes one of the most extraordinary comebacks in rugby. Again, a very humble guy, not known for saying much. And Os was one of, if you just look at the numbers, has to be one of our greatest rugby players. Even though he doesn't sort of seem to be the character that we want nowadays in the sport. So I think there's something to be said for South Africa's weddedness to orthodoxy, and the way in which we've kind of loosened up perhaps over time. Maybe it's because our exposure to more and more commercial forms of team sport has allowed players. Jacques Kallis had never hit a double century until he started playing IPL. It was the thing missing from his career, and IPL got him to loosen up and be less orthodox. All of a sudden, double tons late in his career. So I think maybe it's and the story about Hansie, going back to him again, might be one about how we've looked at orthodoxy in our sport.
Is there anyone we've forgotten? I will put forward 2 names.
Yeah.
Joost van der Westhuizen.
Yes.
And Chad le Clos, without making particular arguments about either of them. Do you have any names that you'd like to sort of throw into the pot in conclusion?
My concluding one I had on my list, the obvious one is Siya Kolisi, and
Yes.
yes, obviously. But the other one is Brian Habana, who I think also,
good choice.
In terms of like his longevity in the game, his persistent, and you talk about consistency.
His consistency.
Like barely ever a bad performance. Also a player who's parlayed his kind of playing career into being, he appears on screen in a couple of, sort of shows here and there. Because the other one who's missing, and you talk about the tragedy, the Hansie, you can't move past the figure of Oscar Pistorius. And he presents obviously a completely different type of tragedy in sport. And you kind of wonder about Oscar Pistorius's career without the murder case. And here's a guy who was on the brink of transforming athletics in a way in South Africa, a global superstar, the Blade Runner. I mean, there's so much, the press about him was manic actually at the time. And I think he represents a really interesting case of how we look at sports heroes and the narrative around, also what we don't want to look at. So all the warning signs about Oscar long before the murder took place. And again, you talk about systems that are there to help people in those times. Like, to what extent was that taken account of? So I think Oscar to me is the sort of, he's not one of the greatest, but he's there in the conversation because he kind of falls into a category like that of Hansie, in terms of what if, and then the other one would be Brian Habana.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, by way of concluding this episode, and thanks very much, Ian, that we will be devoting a full episode in due course to South African women athletes who played similar roles in the democratic period dispensation. Yeah.
I found myself almost mentioning, a whole lot of people when we were talking, thinking, yes, but there's also, so that'll be for another time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you very much, Ian.
Thanks, Luke.
Yeah. Cheers.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.